I come to you all today with a rather different kind of video. What I am about to show you, it is more for the locals of my area, East Liverpool, Ohio. Those of you old enough to remember when our area was hit with the most violent weather in our area's history, weather that produced an F5 tornado. I'm talking about that infamous date of May 31st, 1985. I was only 4 years old back then, yet the images of that date will remain locked inside my head, and probably until the day I die. I remember it being very warm, and it was bright and sunny, yet we were under a tornado watch. My older brother had just been dropped off by his mother. We have the same dad, but different mothers, and every weekend my brother would come over and then go back home on Sunday. I remember we were all sitting on a picnic table. I can't quite remember exactly what we were talking about, but I remember hearing this deep roar. It was a very ominous sound, and it was coming from behind us. After hearing it again, only this time it was louder, and that warm air had suddenly cooled down drastically. That is when we all looked behind us, and when I saw it, my heart had sunk deep into the pit of my stomach. I can only describe it as this. The entire sky was as black as coal, and the clouds were touching the ground, and as far as the eye could see. And the way that those clouds were moving, in a way I had never seen before, rolling forward, yet spinning at the same time. My mother immediately went into what I now described as being survival mode. We had a Great Dane, and her name was Ashley. My mom yelled for us to get inside and to wake my father up. Unknown to me at the time, but trailers were one of the worst places you can be in when a tornado of any strength would hit it. When we got inside, my brother and sister were yelling for my dad. I ran to the window and looked outside. The trees had begun to bend in such a way that I expected at any moment for them to snap and become one with the wind. My mother was unchaining my dog from a tree, and then she was frantically grabbing our laundry that we had hanging up on a clothesline. Upon doing all that, she then bolted inside. We had been unable to wake my father. It must have been the tone of her voice, the seriousness of it. "Jim," she yelled, causing him to sit straight up. I can't even imagine waking up to what he did. The old trailer started making sounds as if it were about to rip apart. I remember seeing the walls bending inward and then suddenly outward. By this point, my dad had put us below the bed and then pulled a mattress on top of us. I was so scared, and I was pressing myself closer against the side of the bed trying to get under it. We were all screaming for God to save us. I couldn't believe how fast the weather had changed. 1 minute it was bright and sunny, and then it was as dark as night, and the mighty winds were uprooting trees, and that is exactly what happened to the tree that my dog had been tied up to. I didn't even question if I was going to die. I knew that I was. And to absolutely know that you are going to die, and only being 4 years old, it is a state of mind that a dictionary cannot define. To put it straight, it was surreal. We did, however, survive, and sadly, a few lost their lives that day. The tornado had missed us. A direct hit would have killed us all. The storms continued through the night on that date, so we went to work with my father and slept in a camper. Besides the extreme damage caused by the tornado, the thing that stood out the most to me, it was the expression on my father's face during the brunt of the storm. It was a look of helplessness. He couldn't protect his family. It was truly in God's hands. He was truly bewildered. What I want to do now is I want to show you a clip that I recorded last spring, and I believe that it was April 2nd, 2024, a F2 tornado had struck Irondale, Ohio. I will play that clip for you now, but please stick around till the end, because I am going to play for you a mini documentary about the tornado outbreak of May 31st, 1985. Back then there wasn't any internet, so it was always, remember that bad storm back then? Now we have the ability to actually look back on that day. Okay, here is that clip I took of the storm that produced an F2 tornado last April in Irondale, Ohio. Then I'll immediately play the video that covers the violent tornado outbreak. Please, those of you who lived through the outbreak, share your experiences in the comments below. Now here is a still frame that I captured from the clip that I just showed you. Talk about a money shot. You can see the entire valley as if it were daylight. Truly amazing. Do you guys remember that storm? It struck around 1 a.m. on April the 2nd, 2024. Share your experiences in the comments below. Okay, on to the video regarding the tornado outbreak in '85.
We're talking about the elusive F5. F5 tornadoes are very rare. Out of the 68,624 recorded tornadoes that have hit the U.S. since 1950, 59 were rated F5 or EF5, the most intense rating on the scale. On this channel, I aim to look at all these F5 tornadoes eventually. Some of them get all the attention, and deservedly so, like the Joplin tornado of 2011, the 7th deadliest in U.S. history. But then there are the odd ones, the out-of-place ones. Today we're looking at a tornado outbreak involving an F5 tornado that occurred nearly 1,000 miles removed from Tornado Alley, the furthest east F5 to ever hit the U.S. 1985 was an interesting year in the weather world. It started off with a cold wave in mid-January, causing the freeze of the century in Florida, which damaged 90% of the state's agriculture and caused a $2.5 billion loss. It notably set an all-time low record temperature at Mount Mitchell in North Carolina of -34 degrees. Needless to say, Americans in the eastern half of the country were ready for that warm weather once spring arrived. The tornado season wasn't particularly active throughout late May. There were about 300 tornadoes up to that point, including 2 F4s in Kansas and Nebraska on May 10th. But a particularly violent weather setup was beginning to take shape the last couple days in May. On the morning of Friday the 31st, a massive low-pressure system with an occluded front, that's this purple line right here, was swinging through the Great Lakes region. This was a particularly intense system for this time of year that boasted a deep area of low pressure over northern Wisconsin, measuring 984 millibars of pressure, and a cold front that rocketed from Chicago to the Atlantic Ocean in just 24 hours. The main area of concern, as usual, is this sector of warm, moist air, powered by southerly winds at the surface behind this warm front. The surprising thing is just how far north this warm, moist air was able to flow. Surface winds were above 30 miles an hour, which is part of the reason that southeastern Ontario was able to get so warm. Temperatures were in the lower 80s and dew points were in the mid-70s. This air was ripe and ready to rise into thunderstorms, but did it actually? Well, let's take a closer look at the atmosphere we're working with. Follow me. So at the surface, you have this warm air that's coming in from the south and the southeast. It's all rushing together or converging on its way to the center of low pressure. It's low pressure because there's technically less air, less matter here. And when this air comes together or converges, it has nowhere else to go but up. It can't go down because the ground is pretty hard. So the convergence at the surface is in place. Now, about 30,000 feet up in the atmosphere, winds were blowing out of the west at a blazing 115 miles an hour. These contour lines show the wind direction. The contours are closest together right along this line, which would be called the trough axis. To the east of the trough axis, the winds were spreading apart in different directions or diverging, creating an area of lower pressure aloft. Now, we have a situation where on the surface, winds are converging and rising, and directly above it, winds are diverging. This creates a vertical column of air in the atmosphere where wind is able to rise violently into a thunderstorm. But here's the key. The wind is changing both speed and direction with height. So this entire column of air is actually twisting and rotating as it's rising. In turn, this is how thunderstorms rotate, which ultimately produces tornadoes. Finally, in between the surface and the jet stream is a layer of drier air called the elevated mixed layer. This is acting like a cap, preventing the moist air from the surface from rising violently. But solar heating from the sun and other atmospheric disturbances can slowly erode the elevated mixed layer throughout the morning and early afternoon. And once some of this surface air breaks through, you're in for a long, violent tornado outbreak. Now, it's important to note that None of this was happening without warning. The National Severe Storms Forecasting Center issued a moderate risk of severe weather over the eastern Great Lakes for the 31st. However, the day before, a similar setup was happening to the west, and a high risk was issued for Iowa and Wisconsin. This resulted in 17 tornadoes, but the highest rated tornado was only an F3. To make matters worse, by 3:30 p.m., the cap on the atmosphere was still fully intact. There were no exploding violent thunderstorms in Ohio or Pennsylvania, so the forecasting center decided to lower the risk even further from moderate to slight. Meanwhile, in Canada, all hell broke loose. Intense supercells exploded over southern Ontario, producing multiple lawn-track tornadoes. But why? How did the air in southern Ontario manage to break the cap? Well, the answer lies in the lakes themselves. The 30-mile-an-hour surface winds were blowing cool air from Lake Erie and Huron into southern Ontario. This denser cool air wedged itself underneath the warm, moist air at the surface and forced the warm air through the cap, birthing a cluster of storms that would ultimately produce the longest tornado track in Canadian history. At around 4:15 p.m., the same time the cap finally broke in eastern Ohio, a tornado touched down just to the east of Arthur, Ontario. Although very narrow in nature, it was flying to the east at near 60 miles an hour, and it hit the center of Grand Valley, a town of 1,500 people. Several homes were completely flattened, and many more suffered irreparable damage. Even though the town covered roughly half a square mile, some homes suffered no visible damage, while other structures, like the public library and the Grand Valley Church of Christ, were just gone. In over an hour, this F4 tornado tracked almost 70 miles, damaging many more homes, farms, and shopping plazas. If this was the most significant tornado to occur on this day, it would still be an incredible feat, but it isn't, by a long shot. You see, the entire time this single long-track F4 tornado was on the ground, a supercell directly to the north had produced 3 tornadoes and was about to produce a 4th. This F4 tornado touched down at around 4:50 p.m. just to the east of CFB Borden, a military base, and tore a quarter-mile wide path of destruction right through the south side of Barrie, Ontario. The tornado was nearly invisible to those in its path, as the supercell responsible was shrouding it in heavy rain and hail. 600 buildings were destroyed. Of those, around 200 sustained irreparable damage. The Albury textile plant, known for their high-quality fabrics, was completely flattened. A mess of red bricks and mangled steel beams. One could argue that this tornado, by today's standards, should have been rated an F5. Many cars were thrown hundreds of yards off of Highway 400. With the abundance of propane tanks within an industrial park in Barrie, it was a miracle none of them were ruptured by a flying car. The resulting explosions might have destroyed half the town. 30 or so boats were tossed into Lake Simcoe and were never recovered. The tornado passed over Lake Simcoe, eventually weakening and roping out. In total, 155 were injured and 8 were killed. It remains one of the worst tornadic events in Canadian state history. The thing is, it could have been a lot worse. As ironic as it sounds, the Grand Valley F4 actually gave Barrie a gift in that it hit the hydroelectric power transformers located to the southwest of the city. This cut off power to Barrie a full hour before the tornado hit, meaning many people left work early and were safe at home. Unfortunately, the day only got worse from here. To the south, the cap had broken and storms were firing off in Ohio. The sun was heating the lower atmosphere all day, and at around 4 p.m., the shortwave trough associated with the low-pressure system had swung into eastern Ohio, causing the disturbance needed to break the cap. And the storms exploded. A tornado watch was issued at 4:25, which likely saved the lives of people who thought the threat of storms was over. The first storms to produce tornadoes were located over Ashtabula and Trumbull counties in eastern Ohio, moving rapidly to the east. These storms were far east of the cold front and had an endless supply of energy ahead. One of these storms produced another drill bit tornado as it crossed the border into Erie County, Pennsylvania. This tornado danced its way to the northeast, ultimately striking the small town of Albion, having a population of about 1,800. The 1,000-foot wide tornado tore right through the center with F4 intensity. Entire rows of homes were flattened. Others twisted off their foundation, then folded in half. To the northeast of Albion was Kennedy's trailer park, which took a direct hit. You'd be hard-pressed to survive an F2 in a mobile home, let alone an F4. The tornado was on the ground for 16 miles, killing 13 and injuring 100 more. At around the same time, a supercell to the south had just crossed the Ohio-Pennsylvania border near Route 322 in Trumbull County, producing a larger tornado about half a mile wide. Marching east, it skirted the Pymatuning Reservoir, hitting the north side of Jamestown. But the real destruction happened a few miles to the east. The town of Atlantic had a population of under 200 and boasted about 100 buildings, and it was wiped clean off the map. The post office, the gas station, the general store, all leveled. 5 were killed. To the east, it demolished an AT&T lawn lines tower, specifically built during the Cold War to withstand extreme conditions. Thankfully, the Soviet Union couldn't use F4 tornadoes as weapons. The tornado continued on to the east, hitting the community of Custards, destroying several more farms and homes. While it stayed on the ground for a total of 56 miles, killing 16 and injuring 200, the damage in Atlantic was by far the worst. And here is where the back and forth begins. Most of the supercells that day were cycling. They would produce a tornado, it would cause damage, the inflow of the storm would get choked off, the tornado would lift, and another one would form a few miles later. The supercell in Barry had produced 4 or 5 tornadoes alone that day, so it's no surprise that as Atlantic was getting hit, the Albion supercell was getting ready to drop another F4 tornado. This tornado was large, about a mile wide, but managed to avoid large population centers. Thankfully, nobody was killed in its 28-mile track. All of these supercells in both the northern cluster in Ontario and the southern cluster in northern Pennsylvania continued to cycle, producing relatively short-lived F2 and F3 tornadoes. But at around 5:30 p.m. to the west, along the I-71 corridor, a long line of supercells was exploding to life. One of these storms quickly dominated the others. This storm, located over Hudson, raced to the east, getting ahead of the main line. And as it was passing over the Ravenna Arsenal at around 6:30, it produced a very small tornado. Just to the east of the arsenal was the town of Newton Falls, Ohio, having a population of 4,800. Traveling nearly parallel to Holcomb Road, the tornado hit the center of town. In a mere few minutes since its inception, the tornado had destroyed more than 400 structures and was entering a densely populated area. Passing by a mile and a half north of the city of Lordstown, Jerry Dre was in the perfect position to capture what some sources claim to be the first video ever taken of an F5 tornado.
First one I ever saw.
That's gotta be a tornado.
Gotta be a little bit of one.
Looks like it's breaking up now, though.
Trailer or something. Yeah, before it got real big right over there.
This is just so good.
About 4 miles to the east and across the Mahoning River was the city of Niles, a town of 22,000. The tornado hit what was left of the Republic Steel Factory, a sole remaining symbol of the glory days of Rust Belt manufacturing. This is a 40-ton petroleum storage tank that was thrown into the center of Warren Avenue. The tornado continued through the north side of town, destroying home after home. At the Niles Union Cemetery, gravestones were lifted out of the ground and thrown into nearby tree trunks. These photos taken by Mike Zahurik in the Niles Park Plaza remind me of images from the University Mall during the Tuscaloosa tornado. To the east, it swept houses in the Shadow Ridge subdivision clean off their foundations. The tornado continued to destroy homes along county roads to the east, the worst of the damage being along Chestnut Ridge Road, to which the tornado traveled parallel, taking out nearly every house on the lane. At around the time the tornado crossed the Pennsylvania border, it had began to reach peak intensity. Wheatland was a small town just to the east of the state line with a population of 1,100. A large steel mill and several trucking companies were located on the western and southern sides of town, all along the Shenango River. The tornado tore through the Wheatland Flats at peak F5 intensity. The companies operating out of the Wheatland Flats were the main source of work for people living in the town, and now all of them were gone. About a mile east of the town was the location of another iconic video filmed by Ron Alfredo, and what might be the closest video of this tornado to ever exist, filmed about a third of a mile away.
Look at all the papers.
This, of course, wasn't paper, but likely twisted steel and sheet metal from nearby homes and warehouses. The tornado traveled 41.5 miles, killing 19 and injuring hundreds more. It is the only F5 to ever occur in the state of Pennsylvania and the furthest east F5 to ever hit the United States. There were many more tornadoes that ruined lives that day. An F3 tracked through Beaver Falls, destroying the Big Beaver Plaza. Another F4 carved a 27-mile path through the town of Kane. The storm that produced the Atlantic F4 went on to produce another F4 tornado to the north of Tionesta, scouring a 29-mile path to the east. And quite surprisingly, late in the evening, an F4 wedge tornado traveled 69 miles through the Moshannon State Forest and the Russell P. Letterman Wild area, causing a mile-wide path of deforestation. This tornado endured elevation changes of over 1,000 feet while crossing the West Branch Susquehanna River. It was truly a mountaintop tornado. The same storm produced another F4 near Elmsport around 9 p.m. and finally an F1 near Drums, deep in the Anthracite region. This was truly the outbreak of a lifetime. Over 44 tornadoes in 2 countries, killing 91 and injuring thousands. The atmospheric conditions in western Pennsylvania truly rivaled those of the Great Plains in many of the infamous tornado outbreaks. Today, not many scars remain. However, to my surprise, we have Google Earth imagery from 1985. And I cannot lie, the scars left in the mountainous forests of western and central Pennsylvania rival those left in Alabama on April 27th. Alabama and Pennsylvania do have similar terrain, Pennsylvania having denser forests and higher mountains overall. Most of the communities that were affected that day were already losing population throughout the 1980s, and unfortunately the tornadoes only accelerated their decline. Niles lost 10%, Albion lost 13%, and Wheatland lost 32%. Since the outbreak, Barrie, Ontario has actually been a small hotspot for tornadoes, thankfully much weaker ones. On July 15th, 2021, the city was hit by an EF2, and in 2014, an EF2 hit Angus, a small town 10 miles to the west. We may not see a similar setup like this in the eastern US for another 10, 20, 30 years. It's truly a generational event. If you enjoyed this video, if you're somebody who just likes weather in general,
Looking at the clip I just showed you, I cannot believe just how lucky we all were. The massive funnel cloud in East Liverpool did not touch down that day, and by the grace of God. If it had of, I may not be putting together this video for all of you. That storm actually gave me PTSD, and for the longest time. Every time the sky would go dark, I would be on the borderline of going into an all-out panic attack. It wasn't until around 1993 when I saw 2 tornadoes in the sky at the same time in Calcutta, Ohio. They didn't touch down, but for some reason that day, I had finally lost my fear of tornadoes and have been infatuated by them ever since. But that is going to do it for today's video. If you enjoyed it, would you kindly hit that like button? And if you're interested in seeing more of my content, then follow or subscribe for more. But that is all for now. I love you all. This is Michael Leonard signing off.